It was just past 9 p.m. on a Thursday in East Los Angeles when the call came in. A teenage girl named Carla had been home alone, waiting for her parents to return from their evening Bible study. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where porch lights flickered and window blinds were drawn early. But tonight felt different. Carla had ordered a pizza around 8:30. Her parents weren't thrilled about her eating fast food, but they wouldn't know. It was just a pepperoni pizza from a shop she hadn't used before. One that had only recently opened. San Gabriel Eats. She hadn't heard of it, but it had decent reviews, and that was enough. At 9:12 p.m., the doorbell rang. She peeked through the peephole and saw a man standing under the porch light. His uniform looked official enough, black polo, pizza box in hand. But something about him felt off. His face was too still, his eyes too dark. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Carla hesitated. Then he spoke. Pizza for Carla. She hadn't told them her name. It was under her mother's account. A chill ran down her spine, but she unlocked the door anyway. Across town, Officer Jim Valdez of the LAPD was finishing up his shift when he got a call from dispatch. It was strange. A report of a suspicious vehicle outside an apartment complex on Soto Street. The caller had noticed a rusted-out sedan parked in the lot for over an hour. Its engine was still warm, trunk shut tight, and no one had seen the driver. Routine call, they said. Just check it out before heading back in. But Valdez had a gut feeling he couldn't shake. When he pulled up beside the car, a 1977 Toyota Corolla, his flashlight immediately landed on the license plate. Partially torn off, almost deliberately obscured. Inside the car was even more disturbing. The passenger seat was stained, the back seat torn up. There was something smeared on the inside of the windshield that looked, at a glance, like dried blood. Then came the smell. Faint, metallic, and beneath that something fouler. Something that told him this was no ordinary vehicle. He popped the trunk. What he saw inside would lead to one of the most disturbing criminal manhunts in California's history. Back at Carla's house, her neighbor Greg Jenkins, a retired Marine, was walking his dog when he noticed the front door to the Reyes home hanging open. That wasn't like them. He called out, but there was no response. That's when he heard the scream. He sprinted across the lawn, kicked the door wide open, and found Carla in the kitchen. Sobbing, shaking, but alive. The man had tried to force his way in, but she'd locked herself in the pantry and called 911. He'd left just minutes before Greg arrived, but not before leaving something behind. Pizza box. Empty. But inside wasn't pizza. It was a piece of clothing. A rosary wrapped in a blood-stained white cloth. When Officer Valdez called in what he'd found in the trunk, the radio went silent. Inside that Toyota Corolla, among the usual junk, fast food wrappers, tools, a rusted crowbar, was something much more horrifying. Photographs. Dozens of them. Some grainy and torn. Some taken in the dark. All of them of women. Sleeping. Undressing. Some were no longer breathing. But one image stood out. It was Carla, in the same clothes she was wearing that night. The LAPD pulled in every available detective that night. Task Force 12, the team once disbanded after the Night Stalker killings a decade earlier, was unofficially reactivated. Some of the detectives had worked that original case, and they remembered the name Richard Ramirez. But that couldn't be. Ramirez was dead. Executed in 2013 after being convicted of 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. He had terrorized California in the 1980s, sneaking into homes at night, often using satanic symbols, killing indiscriminately, laughing through his trial. They called him the Night Stalker. The media believed the terror died with him. But now it seemed the nightmare had returned. Detectives reviewed security footage from nearby stores. The pizza shop Carla had ordered from didn't exist. It was a fake website hosted on a dummy domain purchased just days earlier. The number she called was disconnected by morning. Whoever had come to that door was impersonating a delivery driver. And he had planned it, down to the name. They checked the delivery route. No driver by that description worked for any local pizzeria. When they dusted the pizza box for prints, they found several partials. One of them matched an unsolved case from San Bernardino just 2 months earlier. A college student who disappeared after ordering food late one night. Her body was never found. Then came the break no one expected. Inside the car, tucked behind the glove compartment, was a single VHS tape, labeled only with a number. Detectives played the tape in a secured room. What they saw changed everything. It showed the interior of a house, dim, claustrophobic. A man was talking, but his face never appeared. Just his voice, calm, cold, mocking. And in front of him, tied to a chair, was a young woman, bruised, bleeding, crying. In the background, pinned to the wall, was a faded newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Richard Ramirez executed after 23 years on death row." And underneath it, written in red ink, "He taught me everything." The LAPD now faced a terrifying possibility. Someone was copying Richard Ramirez. Not just copying, emulating, worshipping. And whoever he wasn't done. As the sun rose over Los Angeles the next morning, the headlines screamed, "Night Stalker copycat? LAPD investigates chilling new attacks." Detective Alvarez, one of the lead investigators, made a quiet comment to his partner that would later become the case's most haunting line. He didn't just admire Ramirez. He wanted to finish what he started. Across town, Carla was placed under protective custody. She hadn't slept. She couldn't. She kept thinking about the voice at the door, the empty pizza box, the way he had known her name, her house, and that photograph. How had he taken it? They soon realized there had been break-ins in the neighborhood in recent weeks, but nothing was stolen. Just small things moved. Windows left open, locks scratched, all signs of someone scouting, someone watching. Back at headquarters, analysts were tracing the source of the fake pizza website. It had been hosted through multiple VPNs and dark web proxies, but eventually they found a connection. An IP address had pinged once, just once, before vanishing. It was from a motel in Barstow. When officers arrived, they found the room abandoned. But the walls were covered in photos, names, notes, and in the center of the room, drawn in chalk, was a crude pentagram. At the top of it, scrawled in what looked like blood, "The Stalker returns." Whoever this man was, he didn't just want to kill. He wanted to terrorize, to resurrect a legacy of horror, to make Richard Ramirez live again. And in a quiet neighborhood not far from where Ramirez committed his first murder in 1984, another teenager disappeared that night. A girl named Maria Cortez. The only thing they found was her necklace, wrapped in a pizza napkin. When Maria Cortez disappeared, the Cortez family barely had time to react before the nightmare consumed them. Her mother, Teresa, had tucked her in just after 10 p.m. The girl had school the next morning, and there was a chemistry test she had been nervously preparing for. By all accounts, nothing had been out of place. Until the morning light came, and Maria's room was empty. No signs of forced entry, no screams in the night, no broken glass, just her window slightly ajar, and her bed cold. By 7 a.m., the Cortez home was surrounded by patrol cars. Maria's father, Miguel, paced the lawn, his fists clenched, teeth grinding with helplessness. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, interviewing neighbors who heard nothing. Nothing but the soft rumble of tires. One neighbor said they saw a car pull up just after 11 p.m. A dark sedan. The same description given by Carla Reyes only days before. By 10 a.m., the connection was clear. Another napkin. Same print. Same smell of pepperoni grease. Inside, Maria's cross necklace and a photo. This one was worse. It was Maria sleeping, taken from inside her own room. Detectives Alvarez and Benton now had two near-identical cases. Two teenagers, two pizza boxes, two photographs, one twisted mind. But the real horror came when the forensics team reviewed the trunk contents from the Toyota Corolla again. Beneath the lining, tucked into a crack near the spare tire, they found another envelope, unmarked. Inside, 8 Polaroids, all different girls, all different neighborhoods, all different nights. Some of the photos were old, years old, but one of them matched a recent missing person case. A girl named Rosa Delgado. She vanished 2 months ago. Her case had gone cold after a week. She wasn't just missing now. She was part of a pattern. The LAPD wasn't the only agency watching. The FBI, already monitoring spikes in dark web traffic following the release of several Ramirez-related documentaries, took immediate interest. The signature was too precise, the symbolism too faithful. This wasn't someone mimicking Ramirez's violence. This was someone trying to become him. The new killer left behind traces Ramirez never did. He recorded footage. He built websites. He posted cryptic messages in hidden forums. One message caught analysts' attention. "We are all vessels. Some carry light. Some carry the night." That phrase had appeared in an old Ramirez interview. And now it was the username of a new dark web profile at Carry the Night. That account had only posted one image. A photo of a pizza box. The caption, "Next orders coming soon." Back in East LA, Carla Reyes sat with a sketch artist, trying to recall the face of the man who had come to her door. She remembered the darkness of his eyes, the thinness of his lips, but most of all, she remembered his teeth. Stained, jagged, like they had been filed. The artist sketched, and when the sketch was finished, Detective Alvarez stared at it in silence. He handed it to his partner. Benton blinked. "It looks like Ramirez. Not similar. Not inspired. It looked exactly like him." Reporters descended on the Cortez house by nightfall. The media had caught the scent. Night Stalker copycat made for good headlines. Maria's face was on every news broadcast in the state. The family begged for privacy, but they knew the truth. The police couldn't protect them. No one could, and the killer knew it. Because that night, Miguel Cortez received a text message from an unknown number. Simply read, "She liked the pizza." Detectives traced the phone to a burner purchased in Barstow 2 weeks prior, but it had been shut off minutes after the message was sent. That burner was never turned on again, but the message had already done its job. It made the Cortez family crumble. It made the city panic, and it made the police realize they were being watched. 3 days later, a body was found off Route 66. It was Rosa Delgado, bound, buried shallow, a cross carved into her chest. And beside her, another pizza box. Inside was a note. "You called him evil, but evil knows its purpose." And taped to the lid, a lock of Maria Cortez's hair. Maria was still alive, but for how long? Los Angeles had always been a city of dualities. Sunlit dreams by day, shadowed fears by night. As the summer of 1985 deepened, that contrast turned razor sharp. The city that once shimmered with the promise of opportunity was now wrapped in tension. Its residents double-locking doors, taping blackout curtains over windows, and leaving porch lights blazing until dawn. Because somewhere out there, the Night Stalker was watching. Richard Ramirez had become a name whispered with dread. A shadow in a black cap and dark clothing, slipping through backyards, slipping through screens, slipping through the barriers that once felt safe. The entire county was in the grip of something beyond fear, a sickness of the soul. And as police tried to map his movements, one truth became clearer with every new attack. Ramirez wasn't following a pattern. He was making chaos look like art. By the beginning of July, detectives were desperate. There had been 7 more home invasions in the past 3 weeks alone, from Sun Valley to Arcadia, Whittier to Pico Rivera. Some victims were found bound and bludgeoned, others sexually assaulted, their homes ransacked. He didn't choose his victims by race or age or neighborhood. It was randomness weaponized. Sergeant Frank Salerno of the LA County Sheriff's Department had seen evil before. But this was different. This was personal. He stood over the body of an elderly couple in Monterey Park, the blood still wet on the sheets, and said to his partner, "This guy wants to be remembered. That's why he doesn't kill clean. He leaves pain behind." The killer left messages too. On the wall of one home, scrawled in lipstick, were the words, "Jack the Knife." Ramirez, for his part, wasn't hiding. Not really. He rode the bus, ate at diners. He looked like someone who'd sell you bootleg tapes in the alley behind a record store. Nobody thought twice, and that was his power. He blended in. He was everyone and no one, but he was getting reckless. On the night of July 20th, he hit 2 homes in one night. First in Glendale, where he shot a man in the head and assaulted his fiancée. Then, just hours later, in Sun Valley, he broke into another house, brutalized the mother and daughter inside, and disappeared again before police could arrive. But this time, he left something behind. A sneaker print. It was a simple obvious shoe, men's size 11.5. Investigators hadn't seen it before, but from that night forward, it would appear again and again. On doorsteps, on windowsills, in flower beds. They now had his ghost's footprint. The media frenzy was out of control. Newspapers labeled him the walk-in killer, before settling on something darker, the Night Stalker. Talk radio callers blamed Satanism, cults, or even government experiments. Every night, the city tuned in to the 10 o'clock news, waiting to see who the killer had struck next. Parents pulled their kids from sleepovers. Gun stores couldn't keep ammunition in stock. But no one was more haunted than those who survived him. Maria Hernandez had fought back. She'd stared down the barrel of Ramirez's gun in her own garage and lived to tell about it. She remembered his teeth. Rotten, gapped, his breath sour with something foul. She remembered the way he laughed when he missed the first shot and fired again. "I saw the devil that night," she told the news. "And he saw me." The detectives were chasing smoke. Ramirez left no fingerprints. He moved fast, struck at random, and left his victims too traumatized to describe him clearly. But they were closing in. Slowly. In early August, another break. A stolen Toyota was found abandoned in a parking lot. Inside, a single fingerprint on the rearview mirror. It was run through every database in California. Days later, the match came back. Richard Ramirez. A drifter. Multiple prior arrests. A known burglar. They had a name. They had a face. The media held the image of Richard Ramirez up like a trophy. Grainy mugshot, hollow eyes, a mouth that almost smirked. Flyers hit every wall and bus station. People finally had something to focus their fear on. But Ramirez was already watching the chaos he'd created from the shadows. And what he did next was unexpected. He disappeared. For nearly 2 weeks, nothing. No break-ins, no bodies. Just the suffocating silence of a city waiting for the next scream. Then, on August 24th in Mission Viejo, he returned. He broke into the home of Bill Carnes and Inez Erickson. He shot Carnes in the head and forced Erickson to swear her love to Satan before assaulting her. But this time, something changed. Inez saw his face clearly. She lived, and she remembered. With her help, and a neighborhood watch that had taken down his license plate, the manhunt turned real. The pressure was rising. His luck was running out. Ramirez boarded a bus to escape the heat. He thought he could slip out of LA unnoticed. He was wrong, and what happened next no one saw coming. The heat was rising in Los Angeles, and so was the fear. By the summer of 1985, the city was unraveling. People double-locked their doors, nailed windows shut, and installed floodlights that bathed their homes in harsh white every night. The media had dubbed him the Night Stalker, and though they didn't yet have a face, they had a pattern, a sick, twisted map of death. And with every crime scene, it grew clearer. The man behind it wasn't just a killer. He was a predator. Detective Frank Salerno sat at his desk staring at the crime board. Red strings connected scenes across neighborhoods. Boyle Heights, Glendale, Monterey Park. Each pinned photo told its own nightmare. An elderly couple bludgeoned with a hammer. A young girl taken from her bedroom window. A man shot in the face while his wife was assaulted. There was no rhythm, no consistency in victims. Old, young, rich, poor, none of it mattered to him. Only darkness, only fear. And now they had something else, a trunk. It was July 20th when LAPD pulled over a stolen Toyota. The officer, curious about a strange smell, popped the trunk. What he found would haunt him forever. Inside was a gym bag soaked in blood. There were clothes, women's jewelry, a claw hammer, and a knife so caked in dried gore it looked fossilized. There was also something else, a pair of black obvious sneakers. To most, they were just shoes, but to Salerno they were gold. Weeks earlier, a print had been lifted from a flower bed outside a victim's window. It was rare, a size 11.5 obvious sneaker. Only a few hundred pairs had been sold in Southern California. Detectives had been searching sporting goods stores, checking receipts, trying to connect the dots. Now here it was, right in the trunk. The car was traced back to a man named Peter Pan, a San Francisco resident found murdered in his home just days prior. The killer had driven south into Los Angeles into hiding. But the car was his mistake, his carelessness, and now Salerno had a thread. Forensics scrambled to test the contents. Blood typed, prints lifted, and under the back seat, taped beneath the fabric, was a faded library card belonging to Richard Ramirez. The name didn't ring bells at first, but a DMV photo quickly changed that. The mugshot on file showed a gaunt man with sunken eyes and a chilling smile. He was only 25, but looked worn, like something had eaten at him from the inside out, and his fingerprints matched those left behind in the Pan home. Salerno stared at the photo for a long time. This was him. This was the Night Stalker. The press had been relentless. Every leak, every whisper exploded into headlines. But now Salerno and his team held back. They wanted to be sure, wanted to avoid a media circus that might scare the killer further underground. But someone talked. By August 30th, Richard's face was everywhere. News vans crawled through neighborhoods. Helicopters circled above. And at every gas station and street corner, people whispered. Still, no one knew where he was. What they didn't know was that Richard had gone to Arizona. He'd visited his brother, tried to lay low. But the paranoia was catching up with him. He couldn't sleep, couldn't sit still. He was hearing voices again, seeing things in the shadows. So he returned to Los Angeles. It was the biggest mistake of his life. On August 31st, Richard Ramirez stepped off a Greyhound bus in East LA, unaware that his face had been plastered across every newspaper in California. He stopped at a liquor store and glanced at a paper on the stand. There it was, his face, blown up and bold. He froze. Then someone shouted, "That's him. That's the Night Stalker." Everything unraveled. Richard bolted. He ran through traffic, dodging cars, jumping fences. But the neighborhood was alive. People came out of their homes, chasing him. An entire block banded together, shouting, pointing, throwing bottles. A man tackled him near a fence. Another hit him with a pipe. Blood gushed from Richard's scalp as someone screamed, "Hold him! Don't let him get away!" By the time the police arrived, Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, was on the ground, beaten and bloodied. The people had done what fear and panic couldn't. They had ended it. Back at the station, Ramirez was silent at first. He asked for a lawyer, but slowly his bravado returned. He smiled at the cameras, flashed a pentagram drawn on his hand, whispered, "Hail Satan." But inside, the facade was cracking. As the charges mounted, burglary, rape, murder, Richard began to lose grip. His past came into focus. A childhood filled with abuse, drugs, and violent obsessions. A cousin who taught him to kill. Nightmares that never ended. The courtroom would eventually see all of it. But in that moment, as he sat in a cell under lock and key, one truth became clear. The darkness had a name, and now it had a face. The courthouse steps overflowed with cameras, reporters, and people desperate to get a glimpse of the man who had terrorized a state. For months, Richard Ramirez had been a myth, a shadow that crept through windows and snuffed out lives. But now, chained and smirking beneath the blazing California sun, he was no longer a ghost. He was flesh and blood. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick. Spectators leaned forward in their seats. Jurors clutched their notepads. Prosecutors sharpened every word like a blade. This wasn't just a murder trial. It was theater. And Richard, he played his part with twisted pride. He entered with a swagger, hair slicked back, eyes dark with something inhuman. As the charges were read, 13 counts of murder, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. He showed no remorse, no fear, just that same mocking grin. And then, in front of the stunned courtroom, he raised his hand. A pentagram was drawn across his palm. "Hail Satan," he whispered. Gasps filled the room. The judge banged his gavel. The show had begun. The prosecution moved like surgeons. Each witness, each photo, each gruesome detail, they presented it methodically, precisely. There was DNA evidence, bloodstains, matching shoe prints, ballistic tests. Survivors took the stand, their voices trembling but firm. One woman described how she woke to find Ramirez in her bedroom, eyes glowing like coals in the moonlight. She survived only because he fled when he thought someone else was in the house. Another recalled the metallic taste of blood and the sickening stench of sweat as he whispered threats into her ear. Her story, raw and shaking, painted a picture no jury could forget. But what sealed it wasn't just evidence. It was behavior. In court, Ramirez laughed. He winked. He turned to women in the audience and mouthed, "Call me." One day, a group of female admirers waited outside the courtroom, hoping for a smile from the killer. It was surreal, like a circus held in a graveyard. The defense was weak. They argued that Ramirez was mentally ill, a product of abuse and delusion, that his cousin, a Vietnam veteran who had shown him photos of decapitated women and taught him how to kill, had poisoned his mind. They said Ramirez was a victim before he ever became a predator. But the jury wasn't buying it. They saw the photos, heard the screams, witnessed the destruction firsthand. And when the verdict came down on September 20th, 1989, it was deafening. Guilty. All counts. 13 murders. 5 attempted murders. 11 sexual assaults. 14 burglaries. The courtroom erupted. Outside, the crowd cheered. But inside, Richard barely reacted. He leaned back, crossed his arms, and smirked, like it was all a joke. The judge sentenced him to death. "You are not fit to live among civilized society," the judge said. "You will die in San Quentin." Richard responded with one final promise. "Big deal. Death always comes with the territory. I'll see you in Disneyland." San Quentin Prison became Ramirez's new home, a concrete tomb overlooking the bay. On death row, he was kept in isolation. He wrote letters, gained followers. Some still believed he was misunderstood. Others were obsessed with his dark allure. He even married. In 1996, a magazine editor named Doreen Leoe became his wife. She claimed he was innocent, that the system had failed him. But the evidence never faded. The survivors never forgot. Years passed. Appeals were filed, rejected, filed again. But the man who once slipped through shadows was now caged. And slowly, his body began to fail. In 2013, Richard Ramirez died of complications related to B-cell lymphoma while still on death row. He was 53. No final words. No justice served by a needle. Just silence. In the end, the Night Stalker's reign ended not with a scream, but with a hospital monitor beeping into stillness. But for those he hurt, the wounds remain. The fear, the memories, the nights they still double-check their locks. Because evil like his doesn't disappear. It just waits for the dark. The Los Angeles Superior Court had never seen a media frenzy like this. Helicopters hovered above. Reporters lined the courthouse steps, and the air was thick with tension. Inside, a sea of spectators, journalists, and victims' families filled every bench. They weren't just here for justice. They were here to stare at the face of evil. Richard Ramirez entered the courtroom in shackles, dressed in black, his unkempt hair hanging in strands around his pale face. He looked more like a rock star than a serial killer, but his eyes told a different story. Dead, empty, soulless. He turned to the press with a twisted grin and raised his hand to display the pentagram inked onto his palm. "Hail Satan," he whispered. Gasps echoed. Cameras clicked like gunfire. Judge Tynan called the court to order, but the atmosphere was already set. This wasn't going to be a standard trial. This was a reckoning. The prosecution began by painting a picture of a man possessed by darkness. They laid out the timeline, the 14 confirmed murders, the rapes, the beatings, the home invasions. They presented evidence: DNA, fingerprints, eyewitnesses, and the infamous Avia shoe print. The shoe that walked in blood. The shoe that led to Richard's downfall. But the real bombshell came when the survivors took the stand. Testimony after testimony rocked the room. One woman, tears streaking her face, described waking to find Richard in her bedroom, breathing heavily, eyes gleaming in the dark. Another sobbed as she recalled pretending to be dead to survive. Every story brought new horror, and through it all, Ramirez remained calm, sometimes smiling, sometimes laughing. A defense attorney tried to argue mental illness, citing Richard's traumatic upbringing, his brain injuries as a child, his obsession with satanic rituals. They painted him as a man broken by life long before he picked up a knife. But the jury wasn't swayed. In the gallery, families of the victims held hands, closed their eyes, or wept silently. One mother clutched a photo of her teenage daughter, stolen in the night and never seen alive again. Day after day, the testimonies chipped away at Ramirez's mystique. He wasn't a demon. He wasn't supernatural. He was a man. A deeply disturbed, sadistic man who thrived in shadows and silence. The trial lasted nearly a year, marred by delays, appeals, and even juror threats. One juror was found murdered during the trial, causing chaos and rumors of Ramirez's influence reaching beyond prison walls. But it was later discovered to be unrelated. Still, the paranoia lingered. When the jury finally returned with a verdict, the room held its breath. Guilty, on all counts, 13 death sentences, 19 life sentences, dozens of years for the other crimes. The courtroom erupted, not with celebration, but with relief. Richard Ramirez stood, smiled at the victims' families, and said, "Big deal. Death always went with the territory. See you in Disneyland." There was no remorse, no apology, only that same icy void behind his eyes. Outside, reporters rushed to broadcast the verdict. Inside, mothers wept. Fathers stared at the floor. For some, justice brought peace. For others, nothing could fill the hole left behind. And as Ramirez was led away, chained and surrounded by deputies, one thing was undeniable. The Night Stalker would never walk free again. But his shadow still lingered. In the alleys of East LA, in the bedrooms where the nightmares began, in the quiet moments when the city thought it was safe. Because evil like his doesn't just vanish. It leaves scars. The courtroom was a fortress, thick with tension, heavy with expectation. It was 1988, and Los Angeles had waited nearly 3 years for this moment. Richard Ramirez, now dubbed not just the Night Stalker but a symbol of nightmare itself, sat at the defense table with that same dead-eyed smirk he wore the day he was caught. But inside, he was unraveling. Outside, protesters screamed for justice. Inside, families of victims sat stone-faced, clutching each other's hands, eyes fixed on the man who had destroyed their worlds. Everyone wanted answers. Everyone wanted closure. But most of all, everyone wanted to see the devil brought to his knees. From the beginning, the trial was a circus. Ramirez entered court flashing a pentagram on his palm and whispered, "Hail Satan," under his breath like a prayer. Reporters filled every seat. Sketch artists fought for space. But the jury, the 12 ordinary citizens chosen for this extraordinary task, were the ones who mattered most. They sat in silence as prosecutor Philip Halpin began to lay out the state's case. Methodically, mercilessly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "what you are about to hear is not fiction. It is not the product of a novelist or a horror film. It is real. It happened. And the man who made it happen sits before you." Halpin walked them through each of the 14 murders. The rapes, the burglaries, the desecrations. He showed crime scene photos, each more harrowing than the last. The jury winced, but didn't look away. He played 911 calls, each one thick with terror, each one a reminder of how helpless the city had felt. Ramirez didn't flinch. If anything, he seemed to enjoy it. One witness after another took the stand. A woman who had survived his attack testified, her voice shaking, her words soaked in horror. She pointed to Ramirez. "That's him," she said. "He said I was going to die. He smiled when I begged." Another witness recounted how her husband was shot in the face, how Ramirez had forced her to swear allegiance to Satan before vanishing into the night. Then came the evidence. The obvious shoe print, still matched only to one pair in Southern California. The fingerprint lifted from the pan home. The DNA on a cigarette left in a stolen car. A gun, a knife, a stolen ring. And tying it all together, Richard Ramirez's own sick boasts. Recorded jailhouse conversations where he bragged about the killings. Claimed he was guided by evil. That he felt nothing. That fear was his drug. But the most haunting testimony came from someone who had never set foot in a courtroom before. A 13-year-old boy. He told the court about the night Ramirez had crept into his home. How he'd been tied up. How he'd watched his mother assaulted. How the man with the black eyes whispered to him, "Don't make a sound, or I'll kill her." The room fell silent. Even Ramirez stopped smiling. Defense attorney Joseph Gallegos tried to paint a different picture. He brought up Ramirez's childhood, his abusive father, the violent cousin who returned from Vietnam with trophies of war and a taste for blood, the drugs, the head injuries, the satanic obsession. But it wasn't enough. The jury had seen the photographs, heard the screams, felt the weight of grief. After 22 months of testimony, arguments, and delays, including one juror being murdered during the trial, the time came. October 3, 1989. The verdict was read. Guilty on 13 counts of murder, on 5 counts of attempted murder, 11 counts of sexual assault, 14 counts of burglary. Ramirez sat motionless. No tears, no panic. The families in the courtroom wept quietly. Some prayed, some simply stared. The judge then addressed Ramirez directly. "You showed no mercy. You shall receive none." He was sentenced to death 19 times. As he was led away, Ramirez turned to the gallery, his voice low and mocking. "Big deal. Death always comes with the territory. I'll see you in Disneyland." It wasn't remorse. It was defiance. But for the city, for the victims, and for those who had lived in fear, it was enough. The monster had been caged, and soon the darkness would end. It had taken over 2 years to bring Richard Ramirez to trial. 2 years of preparation. 2 years of piecing together the shattered lives he had left in his wake. And now, in the spring of 1989, the courtroom in Los Angeles County was overflowing. Reporters crammed into every seat. Family members of the victims sat shoulder to shoulder with strangers who had waited hours just to catch a glimpse of the man who had terrorized California. Richard Ramirez entered the courtroom in shackles. Thin, pale, and dressed in black, he scanned the room with the same unsettling smirk that had haunted victims' families for years. Some believed he enjoyed it, the attention, the fear, but others saw something else. A man unraveling, a shell of what he once was. He whispered again to the cameras as he sat down, his voice calm but eerie. "Hail Satan." The trial was the longest and most expensive in California history at the time. The evidence was overwhelming: fingerprints, eyewitness accounts, stolen items recovered from his belongings, ballistics. More than 100 witnesses took the stand. Each one added a brick to the wall of horror that defined Richard's crimes. The prosecution spared no detail. Jurors heard how he bludgeoned victims with hammers, shot them in their sleep, raped women, and in some cases children, then vanished into the night like a phantom. They were shown photos of bloodied bedrooms, testimonies of survivors who could barely look him in the eye. But the defense tried to paint a different picture. They pointed to his traumatic childhood, his violent cousin who showed him war photos of decapitated victims, the drug use that scrambled his brain. They hinted at mental illness, satanic delusions, and voices in his head. It didn't matter, because every time Richard smiled, every time he waved at the cameras or laughed when someone cried, the jury saw the truth. The evil wasn't in his past. It was in the present, sitting right there before them. On September 20th, 1989, after over 100 days in court and countless hours of testimony, the jury returned with their verdict. Guilty. 13 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, 11 sexual assaults, 14 burglaries. When the judge asked if the defendant had anything to say before sentencing, Richard stood and grinned. Big deal. Death always went with the territory. See you in Disneyland. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. He showed no remorse, not a flicker of regret. And for the families watching, it was a final stab to the heart. The judge sentenced Richard Ramirez to death, placing him on death row at San Quentin State Prison. But even behind bars, the shadow he cast never faded. He became infamous, his name whispered with dread. He received letters from admirers. Some called him a rock star of crime, but others knew better. He was a monster. Years passed. Ramirez appealed his conviction. He aged, grew sicker, and in 2013, before he could be executed, he died of cancer in a hospital at the age of 53. No closure. No justice served by the state. Just an end. But for the people of Los Angeles, for the families who lost everything, the scars remained. They remembered how he crept through windows in the dark, how he whispered evil into the night, how he tore apart lives without a second thought. And they remembered that day in court when the verdict rang out, when the monster was finally named. Richard Ramirez wasn't just a killer. He was a storm of chaos, a living nightmare. But in the end, he didn't get the glory he craved. He died alone, forgotten by the world that once feared him. And that was the truest justice of all.